I saw MTV for the first time probably in 1983. I was a preteen at the time and so fascinated with this channel. I would come home from school and throw my books on the sofa and turn on the TV right away so I could watch MTV. And I credit MTV for introducing me to so many artists. Like, sure, I would hear their songs on the radio, but a lot of times I would learn about a new song and a new artist first through MTV. Artists like Prince, Madonna, Michael Jackson, Eurythmics, Duran Duran, Tom Petty. And maybe it was the same for you, or maybe you were more into MTV in the 90s. Maybe you're younger than me, and it was more about the shows like The Real World. Either way, I want to go back to MTV's humble beginnings because it took a while for it to become the cultural juggernaut that it ended up being. But in the beginning, it was actually kind of a bumpy start. So MTV launched August 1st, 1981, and when it launched, it was originally only available to a few thousand households in northern New Jersey that had a particular cable package. Not only that, it premiered at 12:01 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and so basically very few people were watching. In fact, the first VJs, which I'll talk more about later, had to catch a ferry from New York to New Jersey just to see the premiere of MTV because it wasn't being shown anywhere in New York. When it went live, the first thing the handful of viewers saw was a short clip that showed footage from the first space shuttle launch that happened earlier that year and the Apollo 11 moon landing. The words, "Ladies and gentlemen, rock and roll," were spoken, and they had also inserted an animated flag with the MTV logo on it next to the astronaut. After that, the MTV theme song played, and here's a little bit of a clip from that clip.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
And you might already know this, but the first video played was "Video Killed the Radio Star" by the Buggles. This wasn't a very well-known song here in the US. It had only peaked at number 40. But MTV's program director, Steve Casey, wanted to play this video. He said it was symbolic. He did get some pushback from other executives, but when he reminded them that hardly anyone would be watching anyway, they finally gave in. So when MTV was first starting out, a lot of record companies weren't on board because they didn't understand what it was about. The very idea of a music video channel was new to them, and so they weren't understanding what the channel was asking them for. And so labels like Polygram and MCA even refused to hand over their artist videos for free because they didn't get it. But of course, years later, once MTV got established, the opposite would come true, where the record labels would beg MTV to play the videos of their artists. But again, initially, a lot of labels were hesitant, and because of that, MTV had only a library of 250 videos, and they were provided free by a handful of record labels. And these videos had to be repeated over and over again because they had so few. 250 might sound like a lot, but when you're airing 24/7, like, it gets old really quick. And in fact, the first day, The Who's "You Better You Bet," April Wine's "Just Between You and Me," and Phil Collins's "In the Air Tonight" were all played 5 times. Meanwhile, MTV faced other problems that are comical now, but probably weren't very funny at the time. Sometimes a video would get interrupted mid-air. Sometimes there was static. Occasionally, the screen went black when an employee at MTV inserted a tape into a VCR, and sometimes the VJs would announce the wrong artist. They would say something like, "That was Styx," but it would be an REO Speedwagon song, or "This is The Who," and a 38 special video would begin. And to make matters worse, when this happened, you wouldn't see a reaction or apology from the VJ, and that's because the footage had already been pre-recorded. So it was presented as live, but it had actually been recorded at one of the MTV studios during the normal workday. So whenever this happened, it just kind of was weird because you wouldn't see this reaction or apology, and they just kind of went on with the show. But obviously, these early kinks didn't stop the channel. While they worked on improving the quality of the programming, they also worked on expanding to more households. And one thing that really helped MTV grow was the expansion of cable. In 1981, when MTV launched, there were about 19 million cable subscribers in the US. But by 1985, cable was in 26 million households, and by 1989, it had grown to 53 million. Another thing that helped MTV grow was a clever marketing campaign that they launched in 1982. If you grew up in the 80s, you probably remember the slogan, "I want my MTV." MTV had famous musicians speak these words, and the clips were shown periodically on the station. Here's a clip from this campaign. It's going to start with Boy George from Culture Club and end with Mick Jagger.
I want my MTV 24 hours a day on cable TV.
Too much? Yeah, too much. Never.
Too much is never enough.
So this was a ploy to get people to call their local cable company and ask for them to carry MTV. And apparently it worked so well that cable companies started calling MTV and asked them to stop with the campaign because they couldn't handle all of the phone calls. But MTV did the opposite. They're like, "This is working, so we're going to run it more." Also, record stores caught on early, and within a couple months of MTV's launch, some of them started carrying artists that they had seen on the channel, and not just from artists that they had heard on radio stations. Another thing that helped MTV gain popularity is the VMAs, also known as the Video Music Awards. It launched in September of 1984, and from the get-go, the VMAs had cultural relevance. Some of the artists who performed that night were Rod Stewart, David Bowie, Tina Turner, Madonna, and ZZ Top. Madonna in particular helped put the VMAs on the map. Like, she performed her hit Like a Virgin and popped out of a giant cake wearing a raunchy wedding dress and eventually started rolling around on the floor. And the media outlets talked about this for weeks, giving MTV more exposure. And ironically, this performance has been named by Billboard to be one of the most iconic of all time. And I rewatched it right before filming this, and to me, it was kind of cheesy. I don't feel like it aged well, but I do remember at the time it was a huge sensation. So many people talked about it, and it really helped Madonna get on the map as well. And speaking of Madonna, I will do an episode about her at some point. I don't know when, but if you don't want to miss that, be sure to hit the subscribe or follow button. And by the way, the statuettes that are handed out at the VMAs are of an astronaut holding a planted MTV flag, which is a throwback to the moon landing clip they showed when they first went live in 1981. And one more thing about the VMAs that I need to mention. The show's still going, but it doesn't quite get the attention it once did. In 1988, the VMAs got 10.1 million views compared to just 5.5 million in 2025. So basically, it's lost about half of its audience. I mean, I personally haven't watched them in a long time, but, I'm older. And I do think some younger people obviously watch, but it definitely just isn't as popular as it once was. And we can attribute that to a lot of things like social media and YouTube and such. but at least it's still going. I guess that's something. So I couldn't talk about MTV without mentioning their VJs, and this is a nod to the word DJ or disc jockey. So they were known as the video jockeys, and the original 5 were Nina Blackwood, Mark Goodman, Alan Hunter, JJ Jackson, and Martha Quinn. And these VJs ended up being a lot more popular than most DJs at the time because you could actually see them. And I think that was a huge factor to their popularity. Of course, the rise of MTV helped. But they were seen as like really cool, likable people. And they were hired to fit certain demographics the channel was trying to obtain. For example, Goodman was the cool, laid-back one, and then Hunter was the jock type. Jackson was the hip radio veteran. Blackwood was known as the bombshell vixen, and Quinn was the girl next door type. Their jobs were to record intro and outro voiceovers, music news, interviews, concert dates, and promotions. These segments appeared live, but they were pre-taped at MTV Studios, which again goes back to their lack of reaction when something went wrong on the channel. In the beginning, the VJs were told to keep their second jobs because MTV didn't know if it was even going to survive. Martha Quinn, for example, kept her job at New York University for a couple of months after MTV aired. Once it became obvious that MTV was going to last at least a few more months, the VJs went all in. And before too long, they were celebrities themselves. They were featured in magazines like Rolling Stone and TV Week, and people recognized them. Like, I certainly knew who they were. If I'd walked past one of them, I would have known instantly who they were. And a couple other examples of this is Nina Blackwood recalls someone asking for her autograph by shoving a piece of paper into a bathroom stall. And Martha Quinn was eating in a restaurant when Bruce Springsteen walked in, and he actually recognized Quinn and went over to the table and said, "Hey, I've seen you on that MTV." So you even had big celebrities recognizing and acknowledging these VJs. There were other popular VJs from the 80s like Downtown Julie Brown. She joined in 1987, and she started out as a VJ, but she was so likable, she ended up hosting Club MTV, and I remember her as well. Another fan favorite was Adam Curry. He joined in 1987 as well, and hosted Headbangers Ball and the Top 20 Video Countdown. And as a side note, Headbangers Ball introduced a lot of young people to heavy metal. I remember my brother watching it, and my cousin, and it was people like them who first learned about bands like Motley Crue, Scorpions, Metallica, and on and on and on. And then I would learn about them from my brother and cousin. It was kind of funny. So there's one more thing I want to share with you about Adam Curry before I move on. In 1993, Curry bought the MTV.com domain name. And this, of course, was the early stages of the internet. And when he told the MTV executives that he bought the domain name, they didn't really care. They thought that the internet was just this little side project for nerds and people like that, and a lot of corporations did at that time. So he was able to work on the website on his own time, and he was also allowed to promote it during certain MTV shows. Well, the website started taking off, and Curry quit MTV in 1994 to start his own tech firm. At this point, MTV finally saw the value of the website and sued Curry for the domain name. The lawsuit was settled out of court for an undisclosed amount, which means we'll never know how much Curry received for it. But when I asked Google's AI about this case, it stated that the deal was, quote, worth enough for Curry to walk away satisfied. So I just thought all of this was very interesting, and I say good for him. Another popular VJ was Pauly Shore. He joined MTV in 1989 and had his own show, Totally Pauly, from 1990 to 1995. And the series mainly consisted of Shore's character, the Weasel, interviewing celebrities, performing short comic bits, and introducing music videos. And Shore was known for his sort of beach bum or surfer dude personality and vernacular. And he also tried his hand at movies, but the movies were largely panned by audiences and critics. But anyway, as MTV shifted more towards shows, the need for VJs evaporated. Martha Quinn, for example, was the last of the original 5 to leave, and she left for good in 1992. This was the same year that The Real World debuted, and I will talk about that show a little bit later. So the original VJs are in their 60s and 70s now, and I can't wrap my head around that, but then again, I can't believe I'm as old as I am either. J.J. Jackson sadly passed away in 2004 at the age of 62. May he rest in peace. But the surviving members are still around. A lot of them, I think maybe all of them actually, might be doing similar work. I think at least 3 of them have podcasts where they're hosting radio shows. So I think that's neat that they're still active in this space. And MTV was so important to 80s culture because it changed how and which musicians became famous. It was a huge factor. Image had always been important when it came to singers and bands, but once music videos came along and MTV was showing these videos all the time, 24/7, it became an even bigger part of whether or not they were successful. I'm sure when they were shooting these videos, they weren't just thinking about logistics. It also came down to the image of the artist, like what were they going to wear? What kind of hairstyle were they going to have? Makeup, and also lighting, and of course the set, and where were they going to shoot these videos. Whatever they chose, they had to be careful because the whole vibe had to support the song that they were presenting. Think about Michael Jackson's Thriller video, which was nearly 14 minutes long and rivaled some movies at the time in its makeup and cinematography. And it's this video, along with Billie Jean, that helped propel Michael Jackson's Thriller album to the top. It's also these 2 particular videos that take a lot of credit for record labels realizing how important music videos were, because again, it was his music videos that really helped propel Thriller to the top of the list. And without those videos, who knows? It may have been popular, but maybe not as popular. So the record label started to really take notice when these 2 videos came out. I'm going to interrupt this episode for just a moment to tell you about my website, shop8099.com, where you can find various products with designs and phrases inspired by the 80s and 90s. I personally put a lot of thought into every design, and I don't use AI because I want them to come from me personally. Every sale helps support the channel, so when you get a chance, please check it out. That's shop8099.com, shop8099.com. So with masterpieces like Thriller, you're probably wondering why MTV started gradually showing more and more shows in the late 80s and all through the 90s. Well, just like any corporation, it came down to money. In 1987, MTV debuted a show called Remote Control, which ran until 1990. Contestants answered trivia questions on movies, music, and television. And what they realized with Remote Control is that viewers were more likely to stay on MTV for longer compared to music videos. With music videos, they might watch a couple videos and then flip away when a video came on that they didn't like. With Remote Control, they were staying to the end most of the time, and they were coming back to watch other episodes of it. In other words, the show brought viewers back to the channel at a scheduled time, bringing a more dedicated and predictable audience. And that's the type of audience that advertisers love. So they had to pay attention to what the advertisers were saying and what they wanted. So they wanted that dedicated, predictable audience, and they were willing to pay more for it. So this made MTV more profitable. So of course, they're going to choose the shows or the items that are making the channel more profitable. I mean, they're a business, so if they wanted to survive, they had to do this. With all this in mind, MTV released The Real World in 1992, and this was a reality show that put 7 to 8 different young adults together in one residence, and they were filmed non-stop. This show was hugely successful and ran until 2017. The Real World was so successful, in fact, that it was one of the longest running programs in MTV history, one of the longest running reality series in history, and is credited with launching the modern reality TV genre. So if you hate reality shows, blame MTV. Not really, it wasn't all their fault, but this was a huge factor. Anyway, The Real World was eventually canceled due to a lack of interest. Viewers started to see this setup as stale, especially since some of the drama started to become manufactured in later seasons. And personally, I never watched the show, but I did have friends who watched it and I knew about it. And, it was popular and it was talked about. And I think what people liked about it in the 90s is that it was kind of the opposite of the 80s scripted sitcom, for example. So people had maybe grown a little tired of that. And it was also more closely related to grunge. Grunge was seen as the anti-80s music movement and more authentic and more down to earth. So you had this show that kind of had the same sentiment. And speaking of grunge, MTV is where I first learned about Nirvana too. I remember seeing the Smells Like Teen Spirit video for the first time and I was like, holy crap, who is this band? Who is this guy with the messy hair and raspy voice? Like, I was blown away. I loved it. And it was MTV who introduced Nirvana and other grunge bands to a lot of people. They even had that MTV Unplugged episode with Nirvana on there, and that one became an instant classic. There was also an album that was released of this episode, and it debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200 chart. And I remember having the cassette tape of that. I mean, it's just a great episode and a great album, like once they released it. So not only was MTV producing these great shows at this point and influencing music in a big way visually, now they were releasing albums and those were charting depending on the band. So by the mid-90s, MTV was still very relevant, but the channel continued to reduce showing music videos. From 1995 to 2000, MTV played 36.5% fewer music videos. Meanwhile, they launched other shows like Singled Out, which ran from 1995 to 1998, Road Rules, which ran from 1995 to 2004 and then popped up again for some reason in 2007. And then there was Total Request Live, which was launched in 1998 and ran until 2008. And then it was off the air for years. And then for some reason, it came back in 2017 and 2018. This was a very popular show. I mean, that's why it ran for so long. The original host was Carson Daly, and they played top 10 songs. So at least it was music related. And they featured live interviews with artists and other celebrities, and viewership of this show was at its highest in 1999. So again, at this point, at the end of the century, MTV was still very popular, still very relevant to 90s culture. MTV even got into animation in the 90s, and one of the most popular animated shows was Beavis and Butthead, which ran from 1993 to 1997, and then briefly in 2011, I guess. I just see 2011. I'm not sure how many episodes they had, but I remember people talking about this show, and I did see it once or twice. It wasn't really my vibe. I remember it was kind of cringy, kind of like South Park, but it was also kind of funny, but I just never got into it personally. But it was a big thing. I remember people talking about it. And as funny as this show was for me and some other people, the MTV of the 90s wasn't the same. Like, I liked the original MTV, which showed music videos. So maybe that was part of it. It was like, okay, this show's kind of funny, but it's not a music video. This is supposed to be music television, not some animated cartoon network. But like I said earlier, maybe the 90s was it for you. You know, maybe it had a much bigger impact on your childhood or your teens or 20s. Maybe you were born in the 80s, so of course you're not going to really remember MTV much if you were born in like 1988. So MTV would have mattered more to you for these types of shows. And actually, in the comments section, let me know what your favorite era of MTV was, or your favorite show, or what kind of bands you discovered. And I want to keep it to the 80s and 90s. I know it came out with shows later like the Osbournes and Jersey Shore and all of that, but those happened after 1999. So just let me know what you liked about MTV in the 80s or 90s. So everybody knows that MTV gradually kept decreasing the amount of music videos they played, and that happened in the late 80s and 90s, but also when YouTube came out in 2005, that was like, a punch to the gut. Now people could just get music videos on demand. Maybe it wasn't right away in 2005, I don't know, but, more and more videos started getting uploaded by musicians. And of course, nowadays you can just play a video on demand anytime you want. Sadly, by the end of 2025, MTV closed 5 of its music-based channels: MTV Music, MTV 80s, MTV 90s, Club MTV, and MTV Live. And I admit I didn't even know those channels existed. I still thought there was just one MTV. But this kind of shows why those channels might have failed, because like for me, I love 80s music and even some 90s, but I didn't even know these channels existed. But anyway, as a child of the 80s who was obsessed with the music videos when I was younger, this is heartbreaking to hear, but I'll forever be grateful to MTV for introducing me to 80s and 90s artists. Again, I wouldn't have known about some of them, or they may not have even become famous if it weren't for MTV. It was because of that channel that I learned about Duran Duran, Billy Idol, Madonna, Guns N' Roses, just to name a few. And I can't imagine my life between 12 and 25 without watching videos on MTV. It was just such a part of my daily and weekly life. And I think that holds true for a lot of people who grew up in those 2 decades. I'm going to end this episode with kind of a bittersweet story. So I was traveling recently with my partner, and we decided to go back to the hotel and rest for a little bit. And I sat on the bed and I was flipping through channels trying to find something to watch. And I decided on a Big Bang Theory rerun. So I've always loved that show. But anyway, guess what channel it was on? Yep, you guessed it, MTV. So the channel that once showed music videos was now showing Big Bang Theory reruns. Anyway, that's all I have for you today. Thanks so much for being here. I hope you'll come back. In the meantime, take care.